Hi, it's Keith from the Evangelical Free Church, Stony Stratford, and we're continuing our series of short talks in the Ten Commandments. And today we come to Deuteronomy 5 and verse 19, and it's very, very short. You shall not steal. Now, I don't suppose for a second most of us would have any problem with that. We'd like to think of ourselves as law-abiding people. We know to take someone else's stuff. Well, that's wrong. But let's look at the context of this when the law was first given. Israel had a system of justice, and I think this is notable. The men who were appointed to be judges were not to be influenced by who a person was. In other words, they weren't to take into account whether they were rich or they were poor. They were just to judge fairly. I think that says something, doesn't it? It does say that society must provide a system which is seen to be fair when it comes to judgment. The other thing is this: Israel actually had very good social care. A system was set up for those who were far less fortunate. Just listen to this from Deuteronomy 26 and verse 12. When you have finished setting aside 1/10 of all your produce in the 3rd year, the year of the tithe, you shall give it to the Levite, the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat in your towns and be satisfied. Certain people, even in Israel at that time, were not well off. No social security in those days. If you were widowed, you had a problem. If you were a foreigner, well, there's a problem there because you could have been seen as vulnerable. And so basically, the Israelites were to care for those less fortunate. And in doing so, rather interestingly, it reminded them that in the first place, everything came from God and had been given to them. So they were to give to those who were less fortunate. So what's the problem? What is the real issue behind this? Tracy, my wife, and I, we really love the old film noir films, and a great one is Key Largo. It's a great setup. You've got Humphrey Bogart as the hero, and you've got Edward G. Robinson as the bad guy. And in the film, Edward G. Robinson and his band of lackeys and thugs basically hold people hostage in a hotel on the Keys, the Florida Keys. And at one point, someone questions Edward G's motives. Why is he a gangster? Well, they just call him a mindless thug. But Bogart says, well, you've misunderstood this. What he wants is more. And so he asks him, have you ever had enough? And Edward G says, well, I don't suppose I ever have. Now that shows the problem that leads to stealing. The problem is this, isn't it? It's wanting to be the center of our universe. Saying that, there's nothing we shouldn't have. We shouldn't be deprived of anything. And actually, in the end, quite simply, it stems from lack of contentment to the place that God has put us in our world. We're not happy with what God has given us. And so we can be guilty of that. We can steal time. We can steal the honor that we should give to God, the worship we should give to God. Well, what's the answer? Well, the answer, quite simply, is to remember just how generous God is. Just as the Israelites were to remember that God is a generous God, we are to remember that he has done so much for us. When Paul's writing to the Roman church, he writes this in Romans 8 and verse 31 and 32. What then shall we say in response to this? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? The picture there is of the sacrifice. Jesus Christ volunteering to do his Father's will and to become the sacrifice, to become the one who pays for our sin once and for all. Now, we'd never be able to stand in God and before God and justify our sin. We couldn't explain that our good deeds outweigh our bad ones. Nothing really can compensate when we stand before a holy God for the wrong we've done. There is perfection in God the Father, in Jesus Christ, and we can't get remotely near that. The solution? Jesus Christ literally took our sin upon himself. Now that's generosity. And when we look at that, how can we be discontented with where we are? Because we have a wonderful future. The way to God is open. The way to be with God forever is open through Jesus Christ, dying for our sins and being raised again for us. Why? Well, to prove that sin has actually been dealt with once and for all. Thank you for listening.